Interrupt this programming for a WGN News special report.
Good afternoon, I'm Taman Bradley. We are coming on the air to bring you live coverage of the United States Senate's final vote on Judge Brett Kavanaugh, President Trump's nominee for the U.S. Supreme Court. A deeply divided Senate is set to approve Kavanaugh, providing President Trump with a big win. Moments ago, President Trump from the White House said Kavanaugh will be a great justice. The Democratic leader of the Senate, Chuck Schumer of New York, called it the lowest point in the history of the Senate. This vote brings to a close a bitter battle. Senators waged war over Kavanaugh's ideology and accusations of sexual misconduct. This vote is expected to fall along party lines. Every senator has already indicated how he or she will vote. Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, a Republican, is said to be planning to vote present instead of no. Senator Steve Daines of Montana is not in Washington. He's at his daughter's wedding. He said he would have voted yes. Democrat Joe Manchin of West Virginia plans to vote for Kavanaugh, breaking party ranks. But that only complicates what has been an extraordinary last few weeks. The vote will wrap this up, but by no means is this over. Senator Schumer on the floor said the Democrats need to show up in November and they need to vote. There are protests outside the United States Capitol. We've also seen demonstrations inside, angry constituents yelling at senators. We saw a week ago, Senator Jeff Flake ended up cornered with people yelling at him. He slowed down the process, calling for an FBI investigation of the claims made by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, who attended high school with Judge Kavanaugh. She, of course, gave that moving and emotional testimony. There's the scene outside of the United States Supreme Court. You can see people are gathered. These are people who, most of them presumably against Judge Kavanaugh being appointed to that court. His being on that court will tilt it slightly to the right, and that is something that Democrats do not want to see for another generation. Why don't we actually go to the United States floor, or the Senate floor? That is the Republican leader, Mitch McConnell. He's very much responsible for how we got here today. Let's listen in.
The president nominated a brilliant student of the law. Those who taught and knew the nominee at Yale say, quote, "It is hard to name anyone with judicial credentials as strong as Judge Kavanaugh." They describe a true intellectual, a leading thinker, and a wonderful mentor and teacher. And those he's mentored, a diverse group of bright young lawyers who've clerked for Judge Kavanaugh, talk about his work ethic, his unflinching, honest advice, and his fundamental humility. For 12 weeks, the Senate has seen that this is not empty praise. We've seen the legendary preparation of a tireless judge. We've seen the patience of a committed mentor and teacher. We've seen the humility of a true intellectual who let his record speak for itself. Each of us have seen this for ourselves. Every senator who came into this process with an open mind has seen that very same Brett Kavanaugh firsthand. We've seen his brilliance, his painstaking thoroughness on display in the 300-plus opinions he issued on the D.C. Circuit. For 12 years, Judge Kavanaugh excelled on the bench that many experts see as the second most important court in our nation. We've seen his geniality and kindness firsthand in our private meetings with the nominee, precisely the collegial approach that is so necessary on the court. We've seen his professional excellence as we reviewed more pages of documents pertaining to Judge Kavanaugh's career than for any other Supreme Court nomination in our history. Pages that depict a meticulous and dedicated.
So let's leave that. We will rejoin what's going on in the Senate in just a moment. We want to bring in our political analyst, Paul Lisnick, also host of Politics Tonight, one of the hardest working men around. Paul, thanks for joining us on the phone.
It's my pleasure, Taman. You know, look, this is a moment that, as you hear Senator McConnell talking about the competence of Judge Kavanaugh, I think Democrats are very, very angry, but it's not because they had hoped to get a liberal justice or a moderate justice on the court. Even with their battle here about Judge Kavanaugh, they were always going to get a conservative justice entering that court. This, of course, became about temperament and sobriety issues and those kind of things. That's what has concerned the Democrats and have really triggered the distress here.
And of course, we were listening to the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. He's very much, Paul, responsible for now President Trump appearing to have a second justice on the Supreme Court. President Obama had a vacancy that came up, but Mitch McConnell made sure that a Republican president would fill that vacancy. And now this is two vacancies, tilting the court to the right.
There's no question. Look, McConnell rolled the dice back in 2016 when the vacancy of Antonin Scalia occurred because of his death. And you're exactly right. I mean, what McConnell said was, President Obama, you have no right to appoint anybody. We're 11 months from Election Day. Let the people decide. Really an unheard of and unprecedented action, but it was a political action. He wanted the next president to make the appointment. I don't think he had much hope it was going to be Donald Trump, but those were the dice he cast, the die he cast. So, and he won. And essentially, Merrick Garland was never even interviewed by any senators, never got his day in court, so to speak. It never went anywhere. And so when President Trump came on board, he had been provided a list. The Heritage Foundation had essentially approved. And the President Trump said, hey, all my appointments will come from this list. He's been true to that pledge. So Mitch McConnell, if he goes down for anything in history, this move may be what takes him in history, because he's replacing Anthony Kennedy. And Tamon, you know, Anthony Kennedy was a swing vote on social issues, gay rights issues, family issues. Anthony Kennedy could go either way, and often towards the progressive side on those issues, though traditionally a very conservative justice. Here, it is less likely that a Justice Kavanaugh will see the same kind of view on some of those social issues.
Yeah, you're exactly right. McConnell won, and won big. This is a lifetime appointment. Brett Kavanaugh is a young man, just 50. He will be on the Supreme Court, presumably for decades, helping to shape the laws of the land. Paul, this was just ugly politically from both sides. During the Kavanaugh testimony, hearing from Christine Blasey Ford, Dianne Feinstein accused of holding a letter that Ford wrote to her and only getting that letter out during the confirmation process. This was just an extraordinary show of partisanship, wasn't it?
Well, there's no question. I mean, look, the Clarence Thomas hearing was contentious. There have been other contentious hearings. We haven't ever seen anything, certainly in recent history, that compares to this. And you pointed out some of the details. I mean, the notion of the Dr. Ford's complaint going and how it got released, we still don't know, but so be it. It got released. The investigation, this FBI investigation over the last week, a lot of questions brought up there in terms of, did the White House control it in a way to ensure that a lot of negative information might not come out? And when I said on air, Tamon, as we covered these proceedings a week ago, was essentially put the competence issue aside, and maybe even some of the sexual harassment issues aside for just a moment, because for me, the concern as a lawyer, and I am a lawyer, was the temperament he presented in those hearings, the anger, the partisan attacks. Those are the things that led the ABA to take a moment, the American Bar Association, who rates these candidates, and also said, hold on a minute, there needs to be more investigation now. So it was a judicial temperament question that I think got raised, but obviously the senators not sharing that concern, and certainly Susan Collins, who sort of turned the tide here, not sharing that concern.
Paul, I think Republicans noticed that issue. Also, the White House noticed that issue. And we saw this week there was a Wall Street Journal op-ed written by the judge to try to allay some concerns.
That was also unprecedented. I mean, you point to me, any justice in the past or judge who was going to become a justice who wrote an op-ed for a newspaper, it doesn't happen. But the plus side of that was Judge Kavanaugh essentially coming forth and saying, look, there have been some questions about a temperament, the way I handled myself. I didn't handle myself as best I could, but rest assured, going forward, you will see the kind of temperament you expect from a justice.
Paul, let's listen into Vice President Mike Pence, who is now in the Senate chamber.
Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Sergeant at Arms has restored order in the galleries.
Really extraordinary scene. I've covered Washington, covered Congress for a while, and I don't ever recall seeing demonstrations during a roll call vote. An extraordinary scene that we are witnessing this afternoon from the United States Senate. Vice President Pence is inside the chamber. If there was a tie, if there were a tie, Pence would cast the deciding vote. He serves as the president of the Senate. Let's listen in. It looks like they're calling the roll.
Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins.
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Continue.
Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn.
Senator will suspend. Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Zoom.
Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Mr. Donnelly. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher.
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Continue.
Mr. Flake. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Manchin.
Clerk will suspend. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Clerk may continue.
Mr. Markey. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
With my friend, the senator from Montana, Senator Daines, who is walking his daughter down the aisle this afternoon. If he were present and voting, he would have voted aye. I have voted no. The pair will not change the outcome of the vote. I therefore withdraw my vote.
The senator has that right.
Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Flake, Gardner, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hovind, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson, Kennedy, Kyle, Langford, Lee, Manchin, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Perdue, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Scott, Shelby, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Wicker, Young. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Coons, Cortez Masto, Donnelly, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Harris, Hassan, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Jones, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Murray, Nelson, Peters, Reed, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Udall, Van Hollen, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy, no.
All right, you just listened to the roll call vote. They called the names of each and every United States senator to see how they chose to vote on the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court. We will get you the vote tally when we have it. Don't want to really share what I was literally counting with tally marks here, but there were more yays than nays for sure. And so 53-year-old Brett Kavanaugh of the U.S. Court of Appeals for D.C., a Republican Yale law graduate, is headed to the United States Supreme Court. What a scene as the roll call was happening. Protesters interrupted. There sound like there were several of them inside the United States Senate demonstrating, shouting shame. Really unprecedented and extraordinary, Paul Lisnick.
Question about that, Taman. And look, what you heard in Senator Schumer's comments before this vote, this has now become an issue for November. I mean, this is done. Judge Kavanaugh, Justice Kavanaugh shortly, as soon as he takes the oath, which he'll likely do later today, he'll sit on the court starting on Monday with its session. So Democrats have one place to look, and that's November elections. But what's been really interesting, and I know you followed this whole process, while it has been igniting Democrats and igniting their support and interest in getting to the polls, guess what? It's had the same effect for Republicans. It's also ignited them. So this is really going to be a turnout election in November, and perhaps we don't know what decisions we'll get before November from a Supreme Court, not very many, and certainly nothing controversial. But if once we start seeing those, once again, that's where, if a price is there to be paid by Republicans, that would be when the time that this price would be paid.
And the United States Senate has acted. The senators have voted to confirm Brett Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court. He will be sworn in and join his colleagues there on the court, on the highest court in the land, a lifetime appointment on Tuesday as they take up business.
No.
Let's listen back in here to some more of the vote. Or this is the post vote. Well, we thank you for joining us on what is really a historic day. The United States Senate voting to confirm Brett Kavanaugh, President Trump's nominee for the U.S. Supreme Court, to the court. There were more yeas than nays inside the chamber. Vice President Mike Pence was there to preside over the vote. There were demonstrations inside the United States Senate. Think about that for a second. People shouting and yelling shame at these senators. Let's listen to the Vice President.
Approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate gallery. Are there any senators in the chamber who wish to vote or change a vote? If not, on this vote, the ayes are 50, the nays are 48. The nomination of Brett M. Kavanaugh of Maryland to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States is confirmed.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask consent the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection.
I suggest the absence of quorum.
Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Is a motion to reconsider. Anyway, that's over with. The vote was 50 to 48. Brett Kavanaugh is headed there. You're looking at a live picture of the United States Supreme Court. As you can see, there are demonstrators out there. They have signs. Looks like an overcast day in Washington. They are quite upset with this vote. We'd heard that nearly 1,000 women, survivors and allies, were going to barricade the east steps of the United States Capitol. What a scene there. You could see all the demonstrators there. The Capitol is not far from the Supreme Court in Washington. These are folks who are angry. These are folks who have been watching this. Paul Listic, who's on the phone, our political analyst. Paul, this is something that the country has been captivated by for weeks.
There's no question. It's been must-see TV. So many people during the Kavanaugh hearings and the day Dr. Ford was there were glued to their sets all day, Taman, as they watched this. Once again, Judge Kavanaugh supporters, Republicans as a rule, behind him. This is the result they wanted. Democrats, progressives, and you really have to watch what happens to women's vote and women's opinions as time goes on. Have their claims have been ignored here? That remains to be seen. Susan Collins, for example, so critical in announcing her vote as being in favor of him. She faces a contest in 2020. A no vote would have meant a Trump opponent in a primary. Now she'll likely have Trump's support, but will she have the support at home in her state of Maine? That sure remains to be seen.
She spoke at length yesterday on the Senate floor. There was great drama about how she would vote. She was undecided. At least she said that she had not made up her mind. And she, for about an hour, defended Judge Kavanaugh. She said he will honor precedent. She said she wasn't worried about him voting to overturn Roe versus Wade. She said that the accusations were not, whereas the testimony was compelling, the FBI didn't find any evidence. It was high drama when we heard from her yesterday, Paul.
Well, that's very true, Taman, but you also have to remember what the senators had a chance to look at was his record of many, many cases in his many years on the bench, most recently the D.C. Circuit, which is often seen as a feeder court to the Supreme Court. Just this last term, he had a case involving abortion rights of a young lady who wanted an abortion, and he basically was, going with every strategic safeguard he could find that would keep her from taking that step towards an abortion. In one hearing, saying, "How much longer do we have until she reaches that 20-week point when the abortion would be illegal?" So my point being that Senator Collins may be right that he will honor precedent. When you look at some of the decisions and positions he's taken in court, his pro-life positions seem to be pretty strong. So that would suggest that a Justice Kavanaugh in the test when it comes to abortion cases, which is called an undue burden test, is more likely to find challenges to women's rights that would get in the way to not be an undue burden as opposed to a burden. That's what we might expect on gay rights issues, on executive power, and that's the real concern for Democrats. This is the judge who wrote an article saying the president shouldn't be investigated, shouldn't be charged with anything while they're sitting in office. So that's, many Democrats have said that's one of the reasons President Trump wanted him on the bench, was because if and when, and more likely when, issues regarding special counsel make their way up to the Supreme Court, a Justice Kavanaugh looks like he's more likely to side with the president.
And we expect that Judge Kavanaugh will become Justice Kavanaugh as soon as Tuesday, sworn in to the United States Supreme Court after this Saturday vote. 50 yeas, 48 nays. We had an abstention. That was Lisa Murkowski, a Republican. She would have voted against him, but she chose not to vote. We can tell you that both Illinois senators are Democrats, Dick Durbin and Tammy Duckworth. They voted no. Senator Durbin spoke before the vote. We do have that sound. We'll get that ready for you so that we can play that. President Trump, before the vote, spoke to reporters outside the White House. He said that he was going to watch this. He was excited to see how things would turn out. I want to play for you now U.S. Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois speaking before the vote.
What can we expect from this new justice? Will he be the soup kitchen volunteer or the Federalist Society favorite? Will he be the man who raged at the Clintons and promised revenge for his ordeal? Or the judge who impressed Senator Collins as more moderate than most of us on this side of the aisle ever found him? Will he be a justice forever grateful to President Trump who nominated him? Or a justice who honors the rule of law more than any political leader or political party?
So you're looking at the United States Senate. We actually want to go back to the U.S. Supreme Court because we saw the anti-Kavanaugh demonstrators outside, but there are also pro-Kavanaugh demonstrators. There are people wearing Make America Great Again signs, and so it's getting a little heated as they engage. Kavanaugh really did ignite people on the right. There was a partisan tinge, there was a partisan message that was delivered inside the Senate hearings. And so, like just about everything, it seems like in America today, we are deeply divided over this new Supreme Court justice. And that is something that's going to play out in November. It's something that's going to play out in years to come. There are even people on the far left, Paul Lisnick, talking about impeachment.
They are, Taman. And look, here's what's ultimately going to happen. If Democrats take the House in November, you will hear about this talk for impeachment. But I actually think that's likely not to play out. There are other issues, other concerns, Russia investigations that are more likely to take Democrats' attention. So I really don't think that's what we'll see play out here. This, as I said, this is going to be a November election issue because it just is. Beyond that, I think once those results are in, I have a feeling Justice Kavanaugh simply, perhaps with an asterisk next to his name, just as many say Justice Thomas has one next to his name, will nevertheless remain on this court. And you know what? 30, 40 years from now, he'll be Justice Kavanaugh.
Paul Lisnick, thanks for being with us during our special report. A historic day in Washington. Brett Kavanaugh is headed to the United States Supreme Court. He was approved by the U.S. Senate 50-48 with Vice President Mike Pence in the chair. We'll take a break here on WGN. Please join us at 5 o'clock for the WGN Evening News. We'll have much more. We'll continue to monitor that situation outside the Capitol, outside the U.S. Supreme Court, and bring you all the very latest. Thanks for joining us. Have a great day.
This has been a WGN News special report. For continuing coverage, go to WGNTV.com. We now return you to regularly scheduled programming.